Welcome to Innovation and Leadership. I'm Jess Larson. This is part two of our interview with Art Byrne.
Instead of calling it just in time, you could just call it just make sense. And it's just looking at things logically from a different lens. It's looking at it from, the point of view of how do you create flow and pull and standard work? How do you think about things like tack time, etc. Right? I mean, one of the kaizens I was asked to do in the hospital, I went in one Monday and I said, well, okay, what are we going to work on today? And they said, we want you to work on.
If you missed part one, please go back and hear about his 3 decades plus of experience at GE and growing companies by 2,500%, and his book, The Lean Turnaround, and the Lean Turnaround Action Guide. But Art, when we were ending off part one, I was kind of hinting of what I wanted to talk about here. Not so many people think, start talking about private equity and automatically start thinking about lean. But it feels like it could be such a competitive advantage. Can you talk about, after operating a business, now moving to the investment space and bringing this mindset with you?
Sure. I don't think there's any difference, to tell you the truth, because, really, if you're in private equity, what you're going to do is buy a company and then you're going to sell it a few years later. And if you can make tremendous improvements while you own it, you're going to come out better in your investments than somebody who doesn't. And, historically, a lot of the private equity approach was really, you could call it more like financial engineering. How do I buy it and then flip it a couple of years later in some fashion where, the private equity firm and its investors come out well, but not necessarily do a whole lot to change the company other than maybe rip out a bunch of costs as fast as you can. But instead, if you bought it and started right away doing lean and started getting the reduction in waste and get the waste to come out of the company, then you're going to get some pretty big gains over the course of ownership that are going to translate into a better result. We always approach the private equity part that if we're going to buy a company, we always want to run it as if we're going to own it forever. And implementing lean is something that, it's something that takes time. It happens over years, not over weeks or months. And so we just keep pounding away at removing the waste. And bit by bit, the earnings are coming up, the inventory turns are going up, customer service is getting better, you're gaining market share, and the enterprise value goes up. And at the end of the day, when you're in the private equity business, it's really kind of all about improving the enterprise value of the business you bought.
And so I know J.W. Childs, I think they manage about a little over $3 billion in assets at this point. And at your time there, you guys were primarily focused on mid-market. Is that right?
Yes, pretty much mid-market companies with some sort of connection to the consumer. Really, we weren't in the automotive business, those kind of things, but other kind of markets. But a lot of them were manufacturing businesses.
Yeah. So we were talking before about this idea of how staff, they might resist it at first, but when they realize, hey, the boss is actually leading with some more humility and listening for a change, and the people who are closest to the work get to make the suggestions, and all of a sudden people really start to like it and it catches on. And, I can see how it could be a virtuous circle of, hey, my job's safer. I like it better. I feel like I'm winning because we're doing more. It becomes like a sport I want to play. But what about before that? You guys buy a company and it's that first introduction phase of, who are these guys? What's this going to be like? And getting to the point where they actually start trying it before it's caught on. Any advice for those, just that very first step of here's what's going to happen and here's what to expect, or, easing them into it?
Yeah, I think I have a philosophy or an approach to that I think works. And it goes back to really my days running wire mold, because over the 9.5 years there, we acquired 21 different companies, different sizes. A lot of them were fairly small, product line additions, that kind of stuff. And we kind of created a standard work for lean. First of all, in the acquisition process, we made it known to the company we were looking at that lean was our philosophy and our management approach, and that they could expect us to implement that in their business if we were successful in acquiring it. So there wasn't any hidden ball to begin with, and we did the same thing in the private equity business. We let them know that that's how we would try and run the company, and that by doing that it was going to be better for everybody, particularly their employees. So at Wiremold, our standard work for this was once we bought the company, let's say the deal financially closed on a Thursday or a Friday. Well, by the next Monday, we would be at the company, would introduce Wiremold, would get everybody in a room, would give them an overview of Wiremold, et cetera. Then we'd give them 2 or 3 hours of training in lean and the concepts and principles and why would we want to do this. Then we'd let them go to lunch, and then we'd start the first 2 Kaizens right after lunch and run them through the rest of the week. And we got some pretty dramatic improvements, as you might expect, in the very first week. And of course, the employees in the new company were, I guess you could say shocked, like, holy smokes. These guys came in here the first day and started moving equipment around and changing things and changing our layout, but getting tremendous productivity gains and quality gains, et cetera. And I think by doing that, you let the new company know right away what this is going to be like. And it's their employees that are on these Kaizen teams. And so they're getting a taste of it, and they're pretty excited, and hopefully will tell the rest of their colleagues that, gee, you can't imagine what we just did this week. It was so much fun, and we got all these gains, and my job is much better, et cetera. You can contrast that with the traditional approach, which is, okay, we bought the company, now we'll send the finance guys in, and we'll send the marketing and sales people in, and we'll spend 6 to 8 or 9 months analyzing it in more detail, and then we'll determine what we're going to do. Well, we already knew what we were going to do. And it was lean, and so there was no delay, and there was no confusion, because if you do the latter thing, like I just mentioned, spend 6 or 8 months trying to decide and doing a lot of analysis, that whole time the people in the acquired company are pretty nervous. They're not sure what you're going to do, whether they're all going to get laid off or whatever. And if you give them 8 months or so to think that over, some of the better ones will have resumes out looking for a new job, and you don't want to lose those people. And so by starting lean right away, and we did pretty much the same thing in the private equity world. It wasn't maybe the next week in that case. It was shortly thereafter. Everybody understood what the game plan was pretty quickly. So I just think that that's a better approach. And the way we did it is I would become I was an operating partner at Childs, and that meant that, I would get involved when we were doing the due diligence of the company, and I'd, help some of the analysis. But my main function was to walk around the facilities and sort of, determine what could we do with this and how fast could we do it. And, then I would become if we bought it, then I'd become the chairman, and my role was really to work with the management team to teach them lean and get them involved and start doing Kaizen and start to make the improvements. So if you do that, I think you get much more gain much faster than if you just think of it from a financial point of view and don't take any kind of action at all. Yeah.
And it makes so much sense to just start with a bang, and instead of doing a lot of talking, let them actually see a benefit. And
sure.
They don't have to take it on faith when they can actually, they know that job really well. And if stuff gets moved around and they can recognize the improvement right off the bat,
yeah.
Kind of a strong start there.
Well, I'll give you a simple example. One of the companies we bought when I was at Wiremold was out in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. It wasn't that big. It was owned by a Fortune 500 company. Its product line we bought sort of fit with us, and we were going to eventually move this from Coeur d'Alene into another business we had outside of Los Angeles. But the Los Angeles company we were building a new building, and so we couldn't do it right away. So we said, we'll start Kaizen at this company. So it's like I mentioned, we brought all the employees into the conference room, or actually into the lunchroom in this particular case, in the very first day. And was about 90 people, and we talked about Wiremold. Then we gave them a coffee break. Then they came back, and then we did them like 3 hours of lean training, and then they went to lunch. And we said, after lunch, the names on the board are on the first 2 teams. So we went out on the floor, and the team, I had one team, and the president of the company, we were going to consolidate this into, he was leading the other team. And the team that I had, we were working on final assembly. And this business had 4 or 5 pretty long conveyor belt kind of assembly lines that are pretty traditional in a lot of companies. And anyway, long story short, by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we had disconnected one of these conveyor belt assembly lines. We had disconnected it, hooked it up some forklift trucks, and we threw it away out in the backyard. And in the meantime, we created a new design that was going to be in about a third of the space, and we were going to go from 10 people down to 6 and produce slightly more product, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, after that, we went to dinner, and the guy who was the plant manager of this business, who was on my team, he said, "Gee, that was kind of interesting." And then he said, "Does this mean I don't have to write the 25-page monthly plant report anymore?" And we looked at him and we said, "Well, if you're addicted to doing that, you can keep doing it, but we're going to promise you that we'll never read it, and we would prefer that you go out there and fix this mess." And he did a great job. He dug into that. And when we finally moved the business to Los Angeles, we brought him with us as the head of operations for both businesses. So, these are the kind of things that can happen if you start right away and you get people involved.
Yeah, no kidding. What a fun kind of shot in the arm for people. Well, let's do this. Let's take a quick break from our sponsor, and then I have another industry I want to ask you about specifically.
Sure.
So, Art, right before the sponsor break, I was telling you there was a specific industry I wanted to ask about. And, now that at Mylan, our consulting firm, we've become one of the Shingo affiliates, and we're out doing this kind of work with different organizations, we have a lot of interest in the medical space. And I know you've had some experience over there. Can you tell me any stories of some wins in the medical world that you've been a part of or seen?
I can some. My experience there really was, Warrenmole was located in Hartford, Connecticut, and we had 2 major hospitals there. And I volunteered a number of weeks of my time to run Kaizens for one of these hospitals. And hospitals are, as you may or may not know, they're, organizationally, they're a mess. And because they have all these fiefdoms, and you have fiefdoms on top of fiefdoms, and you have fiefdoms within side of fiefdoms, and so those things create most of the problems that hospitals have. And so I did a number of Kaizens there. We did some I started out in the cath lab. We did some in the emergency room. We did some we did one once in the after open heart surgery. How do you create a discharge policy?
Do you remember one of those that you can tell us a couple specifics on?
Yeah, let me think of what might be a good one. But perhaps the cath lab, that was the first one. And the issue they were having was that they were working so much overtime. They had 3 different cath labs, and this is for heart catheterizations. And so they had so much overtime that they couldn't keep staff, and about half of the staff they had were what they call traveling nurses. And traveling nurses, you have to put them up, you have to pay for their housing, and then it costs you about 150% of what it would cost for a local nurse. So it's pretty expensive to run the department that way. And they were looking for a solution. And so anyway, we just looked at this and, tried to figure out what was wrong, what was going on here. And the amount of overtime was really the driver. So you had to look into what was causing that and how did people get into the cath lab, et cetera, et cetera. So it turned out that they have about 50% of the caths that are done are scheduled because the cardiologist wants one done for his patient. And then the other half maybe is more emergency things that happen. But they didn't have any real flow that existed. It's how do you get into the cath lab? How do you get out of the cath lab? And they had, when they bring someone in, they had a whole floor that was nothing but the preparatory and after cath floor. So I asked them, if you have a cath scheduled at a certain time, how long before that cath is scheduled do you bring the patient in? And they said, well, 4 hours. I said, well, no wonder you got everything clogged up. You got someone coming in 4 hours before the cath, and then after the cath, you keep them around for another 3 or 4 hours because they have to hold pressure on the thigh where you put the tubes up, so that so it stops bleeding before they go home. And so we just looked at this, and I said, you shouldn't do 4 hours. You should. And they said, what do you think? I said, I think a half hour. Well, they thought that was outrageous. We couldn't do that. So I took the guy who was the COO of the hospital, who was on the team, and I took the gal who was the head nurse on the cath floor, and I said, okay, you be the husband, you be the wife. I want you to go down to the parking lot. I want you to walk in. I want you to go to admitting. I want you to check in and go through all the stuff. I want you to go up to the floor. I want you to get undressed. I want you to go in the bed. Have everything done, and then tell me what it took. And so I was doing something else. I came back and I said, okay, what happened? And they said, well, it actually took 35 minutes to do that. So, this was kind of eye-opening to them, and they never went to a half an hour, but they cut it from, say, 4 hours down to 2. And at the end of the week, we found that not only did we not have to work any overtime, but if we changed the flow of how people got into the cath labs, et cetera, that they had excess capacity in the cath lab without working any overtime that would have brought the hospital something like $1.5 million in extra revenue every year. And of course, it would have cut their costs dramatically because they wouldn't have had to have these traveling nurses. So, and every time I did a Kaizen in the hospital like that, we got similar kind of results, big money results. One of the biggest gains for a hospital is what you could call bed utilization. They all fight the same thing because you got a sort of fixed cost of beds, and moving people through them is the big issue. But when you look at the discharge policy that most people have, the way that they do discharge, let's put it that way, you can track it, and you're going to find that the discharges all occur right at the end of the first shift of the doctor, so 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then, of course, they never tell the patient that they're going to go home that day. They just come in at 2:30 or 3 o'clock and say, okay, you look good, you're going to go home. And then the patient says, well, gee, you didn't tell me, I don't have a ride, my wife is working, she doesn't get off, I can't get out of here till 6 or 7 at night. So now you got the person, another bunch of hours, you're going to feed them dinner, and after that, the bed's not going to get changed over. And so you could have had somebody else in that bed all afternoon and paying, but you don't. And so I asked the finance guy in the hospital, I said, I want you to tell me, what's the financial impact of a 25% improvement in bed turnover? And he kind of hesitated, but I kind of forced him. And anyway, this was about a $500 million annual revenue hospital. And he said the impact of a 25% increase in bed turnover was going to be $60 million. So if you can think about that, $60 million, there's no capital investment involved. The things you have to do are pretty simple to make that occur. But getting the people to do it is pretty hard. So, I just found that the gains in hospitals were tremendous. And one of the interesting things in hospitals is, in manufacturing or any other business, we think of terms of value streams and flow and things like that. In hospitals, they don't have any things like that. They have fiefdoms instead. But the reality is they have natural value streams. For example, if you go back and let's say we have a $500 million annual revenue hospital, I can almost guarantee you that someplace between $150 million and $200 million of that revenue is in a value stream, natural value stream called the heart and everything related to the heart. But you know what? No one's in charge of that. No one runs that heart business within this company, with this hospital. What you have is you've got cardiologists, you've got maybe cardiac surgeons, maybe you have cardiac PAs, and maybe you have cardiac trained nurses, but there's no business managers. There's nobody running this thing. And as a result, trying to get anything done or get any coordination to occur or get any flow to happen never happens. And yet the value stream, the natural value stream is there, but nobody can see it. So, and you can say the same thing about a value stream for bones or a value stream for babies or whatever. They exist naturally, but they're not organized that way. And because they're not organized with anything like that, there's a lot of waste that occurs in between the fiefdoms.
I think for me, one of the things that's so magic about this world is that it's not that you need someone smarter to come in. You can take the same people and give them a different lens, and all of a sudden they start figuring these things out themselves. To me, that's kind of the extra magic about it.
Right. It is. Well, it really is just, you could call it, instead of calling it just in time, you could just call it just makes sense. And it's just looking at things logically from a different lens. It's looking at it from, the point of view of how do you create flow and pull and standard work? How do you think about things like tack time, et cetera, right? One of the Kaizens I was asked to do in the hospital, I went in one Monday and I said, well, okay, what are we going to work on today? And they said, we want you to work on mental patients in the emergency room. Well, I'm a manufacturing guy. I don't know anything about mental patients in the emergency room, but I said, okay, well, let's go back. I said, what's the tack time here? And they didn't know what that was, so I had to explain it. But I said, what's the rate at which these mental patients come into the emergency room? And then once we had that, I said, okay, what's the flow? How do you flow them through the emergency room? What's the standard work in terms of how you treat them, and how do you pull them through to get them out the other end? And once we started looking at it that way, it became pretty simple. And it was, in this particular case, it was about 20% of the people that came into the emergency room were in this category. And mental patients didn't just mean they were mentally ill. Mental patients, and that just this definition seemed to mean that they were uncommunicate. You couldn't communicate with them, so they could be drunk or on drugs or whatever, and they sort of fit this category. But if you just brought them into the emergency room and then they had to wait around for a couple hours, they were causing massive disruption. And that was the big problem they were having, is they were wandering around and bothering everybody, and you had to control them. And so we just set up, we broke it into 3 separate flows. We had one flow for these mental patients, and they had some space right next to the emergency room where we could create a place to put them and treat them. And we could lock the door so they couldn't come back out once they got in there, and they could flow through that. And then we created another flow for patients that came in that were triaged, and it was pretty clear that they were going to need a bed for the night. And then a third flow, I called it the boo-boo flow, which wasn't very sophisticated, I guess, by hospitals. But what it meant was, look, this is somebody who's going to come in, we're going to treat him and send him home. A boo-boo could go all the way from having a cold to you broke your wrist, you broke your ankle, we're going to set it, give you a cast, give you some crutches, and off you go. But if you set up the 3 flows in the emergency room like that, and then if you convince the admissions department that they didn't really need to have all the information they tended to take up front, they just needed to have it before the person left, so that you could bill them or bill their insurance company or whatever it was going to be. So, once you started doing that, now the flow and the rate at which people went through was much faster. The wait times could go down, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of things are possible in hospitals. Hospitals, I just think step on their own feet all the time.
Those are great examples. Well, listen, maybe as a final question here, you think about folks like us at Mylan trying to be consultants in the space and help organizations want to embrace this as a full enterprise mindset, not just somebody in operations.
Right.
What advice would you have for us as we have somebody come from some pocket of the organization and they want leadership to get involved, or they want it, they're hoping that the rest of the organization embraces it, and they're looking to us saying, hey, how do we entice the whole organization to want to do this? Because I believe, what about everybody else? What advice would you have for me to give someone like that?
Somebody that already believes that the CEO already believes, you mean?
Yeah. So it's a division manager, or it's somebody in this pocket, and they're saying, hey, I want the whole organization to do this, but I'm not the CEO. How do you help them try to influence the rest of the organization, or how do they invite higher levels of management to recognize what's possible in your mind?
Well, I think let's go back to how do you do this stuff in the first place. You can't teach somebody this. The one thing you don't want to do as a consultant in this particular space is run around giving PowerPoint presentations. That's a waste of time. Why would you do that? What you're really trying to do is to help people see and remove the waste. And the only way you can learn lean is by doing it. So lean is something you have to learn by doing. And that means if you're the consultant, and, I would say, look, if we're going to help you, then you, Mr. CEO, you, Mr. Head of Operations, you're going to be on these Kaizens. You're going to be part of these Kaizens. And if you don't want to do that, I'll go find another client. So you have to be willing to fire your clients. You have to understand that this is learned by doing, and that you've got to get them engaged, and you've got to get them out on the floor so that people see them, and that you're teaching them as you go along through the week. You don't want to be in a conference room giving PowerPoint presentations. We work with the Japanese, and of course, we don't understand Japanese. They didn't understand English. We never, ever had a PowerPoint presentation of any kind in all the years I worked with them. And I didn't care, because if I put them on the floor and said, where's the waste? Show me how to get rid of it. It was instant. We could get that right away. And we could figure out the rest. I mean, we weren't idiots, but what we wanted them to do was show us and show our people how to remove the waste. And, a lot of these companies that are consulting, they're selling an MRP program in disguise, or they're great at PowerPoint, but you put them on the floor and they don't know where the waste is either. So
I love it. Well, we appreciate all the time you spent with us here. Obviously, encourage everybody to go to Amazon and get a copy of your book, The Lean Turnaround by Art Byrne. And Byrne is Byrne, for anybody who didn't know. Art, thanks again for making time for this. We appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, thanks for having me. Take care.
Well, that's it for the episode. One other thing I wanted to tell you about if you remember the guys from Convoy in episodes back, Ken Free and Trent Mano, I went on one of their CEO trips to New York, and I met a guy named Brent Thompson, very successful entrepreneur. He was former CEO of Jive Communications, big company now, I think $300 or $400 million. Anyways, he started a new company called blipbillboards.com. I'm super stoked they're a sponsor now. But I remember a year and some ago when I met him, I thought it was genius. Instead of having to buy 6 months or a year's worth of billboard for thousands of dollars, you can buy 8 seconds at a time for like 10 or 20 cents. You pick what billboard you want it on, what time of day you want it to run. And it just puts so much power in the hands of marketers and CEOs who want to try something and see if it works. You can buy as many or as few as you want, change it as many times as you want. I think now our podcast is being advertised on billboards in like 18 different states because we have these guys as sponsors. We're pretty excited about it. Hope you check out blipbillboards.com. Thanks.